Since we're starting the summer class by reading Emma, which I think is one of the best novels written in English and also I think a really important one, I want to talk very quickly about why I think it's important. And to do that, we're going to start by talking about the beginnings of the novel in England and look at some of the reasons that the domestic novel, which includes the marriage plot, which is basically the question of how and will a young woman get married, why it becomes one of the most popular genres of novels by the time Jane Austen wrote Emma in 1816. The genre that we recognize as the novel today grew out of the tradition of romance and epic. So think in terms of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or King Arthur and the Round Table, or even the Iliad and the Odyssey. But we're talking about these sort of fantastical, exciting adventures, huge plots, huge sets, huge scope. But by the middle of the 18th century, the novel had shifted from that perspective to an idea of formal realism, which is a term coined by Ian Watt in a book called The Rise of the Novel, which was written in 1957, and which is extremely influential in the history of the novel. And in this book, Watt describes the novel's efforts to present life as it is, with all kinds of human experience. So we're going to take a look at some of the titles of some of the best known 18th century novels that were really early forms of what we consider the novel now. And this is the full title of Robinson Crusoe. As you can see, the full titles of some of these earliest novels straddled the line between telling real and romantic stories, but they were also invested in depicting themselves as real stories that could potentially happen to real people. So many of the titles of these early novels exist as mini summaries of the stories, and many of them, as here with Robinson Crusoe, claim to be written by the character himself. That is, they claim to be autobiography. Despite the fact that Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, which is the title that we see here, are definitely fiction, most readers understood that, although there were a few that accepted them as factual. Many authors used this new interest in realism as opposed to romance to write novels that purported to be journals or travelogues or fact as opposed to fiction. Another one of Daniel Defoe's novels, Daniel Defoe is the author of Robinson Crusoe and also Moll Flanders. This novel is told from the perspective of the main character, and in the title it claims that it is, quote, written from her own memorandums. So this claims to be something, an autobiography that she has written based on her novel and on her journals and on her notes. In Moll Flanders, the main character discusses the difficulty that she, as, quote, author, faces when writing her true story in the face of the popularity of romances and other fanciful stories. So again, we have an effort on the part of the authors, like Daniel Defoe in this instance, to show the realism of the novel by doing it through his character who is supposedly writing a true story. Most of these early novels are still stylistically very fragmented. They are written as a series of events strung together or as a travel narrative or as a journal, where the narrative thread gets constantly separated into small parts. In this way, they are different from more fully developed novels that we see now. However, whereas earlier romances were concerned with princesses and knights and kings, early novels experimented with strongly individual main characters who were gritty and earthy. Robinson Crusoe, for example, is the third son of a tradesman, so he's not rich, not noble, not the heir of whatever his father would have to pass on. Gulliver, in the same way, is the third son. His father is a gentleman, so he's of a higher class than Robinson Crusoe, but he still has no inheritance coming his way. By the middle of the 18th century, the most popular genre of novel had become the courtship novel, most of which are about young women entering the marriage market, being courted, marrying. Many factors contributed to the extreme popularity of these novels, but some of the most significant are related to the change in demographics in England during this time. Literacy rates in England doubled from the early 17th century to the mid 18th century. By 1750, 60% of adult men and 40% of adult women could read, and literacy became increasingly common among the lower classes. Further, since the economy was good, the rising middle class was suddenly able to afford a servant, and thus had more time to read. Commensurate with the increase in literacy rates was the publication rates of novels. From 1700 to 1740, about 7 novels were published a year. By 1770 to 1800, about 40 were being published a year, and most of those were courtship novels. So it's a misconception that women had no public voice in the 18th century. During the 18th century, almost 600 novels were written by women, and many of their novels depicted women as strong female characters with conflicts and concerns that would have been very familiar to the target audience. So here's where some of the social history becomes interesting. Earlier than this time period, than the mid 18th century, most marriages, especially among the upper classes, were arranged, or at least encouraged to produce the greatest social and economic advantage. But companionate marriage became increasingly common as the century progressed, and plots and novels that featured companionate marriage became more popular as well. In 1753, a law was passed called the Act for the Better Preventing of Clandestine Marriages, and that legally changed the politics of marriage as well. For the first time, women under 21 were legally prevented from marrying without parental consent. The effect was that couples were less able to divide their parents in the choice of a spouse. As you can imagine, the law was more popular among the upper classes, where economics still played a major role in marriage decisions. Further, although it was becoming socially acceptable to marry for love, it was still dangerous for a woman to show desire for a man in public. Virtue was the most important characteristic a woman could have. Throughout all of this, the amount of the dowry, money given to the husband from the wife's family, generally increased as the century progressed. But the amount of a typical jointure, which is the money given to a wife upon a husband's death, generally decreased. Economically speaking, husbands became more valuable, but wives became less valuable. By the middle of the 18th century, a popular idea, especially among critics of the novel, was that novels should be moral influences. In his periodical Rambler, Samuel Johnson famously criticized the main audience of the novel as the young, the ignorant, and the idle. Another novelist, a well-respected man named Samuel Richardson's two hugely popular novels, Clarissa and Pamela, helped legitimize courtship as an acceptable topic, and his novels emphasized virtue and domesticity as the ideals of women. However, even his novels started to question some of the real fears of marriage that women had. Generally, heroines of courtship novels accepted the social benefits of marriage and ultimately fell in love and married, but they also often expressed sadness at the loss of autonomy that marriage entailed, as you can see here when the main character in Eliza Haywood's 1751 novel, History of Miss Betsy Thoughtless, expresses some concern about marriage. Arabella Farmer in Charlotte Lennox's The Female Quixote, for example, says she'd rather not marry at all, but if she has to, she hopes her family will allow her to marry someone she loves. So this is the tradition that Emma is coming from. And when we get to Emma in 1816, we have a character who is already in a good social position. She has money and status, so she needs to be careful about whom, if anyone, she chooses to marry. Further, immediately in the novel, Austen establishes Emma as a bright and witty person who needs to meet not only her social equal but also her intellectual match before she will marry. So Emma has a little bit more power because of her social position, but there still is a sense of inevitability that she will marry at some point. So by the time we get to Emma then, courtship novels were very popular, but we need to remember that they also frequently had a social aim to instruct women about how to be the right kind of woman. And frequently women who are spirited have a conversion moment at the end of these novels where they reform their ways and they become more passive. As you will see when you read the criticism in Emma that follows the novel, which we will read in week 3, you will see that there is a major point of controversy among critics about whether or not Emma actually is converted and becomes less spirited by the end of the novel when she is able to marry. Some people think she does get converted, some people think she does not. At any rate, these courtship novels, in addition to sometimes talking about how women need to be more passive, they also depict a time in a woman's life when she gets to be the primary decision maker in a relationship. So they talk quite a lot about the power that comes with the courtship situation. As historian Amanda Vickery describes the moment of proposal in these novels, men got up off their knees, and metaphorically at least, women got down on theirs. As you read Emma, think about the extent that her story follows these patterns. A common thread in the feminist criticism on Emma, as we will read, is the subversive nature of Austen's writing, that she purports to be encouraging traditional gender roles, but that she challenges these roles as well. Other critics, especially Marxists, claim that Austen is very traditional. She approves of class distinctions, for example, and reinforces divisions among the classes. You want to think about all of these issues as you finish reading the novel, because I'm sure that they will come up in our discussion as we finish reading, as we read some of the criticism, as you do your own research. But I think it's important to think of ways in which the novel is more complicated than it seems and to try to figure out what kinds of things is it trying to say. So those are the sorts of discussions that we will be having as we read and discuss the novel together.